Politico.com is reporting tonight on the meeting that took place last night in Delaware between President Biden and two of his closest and longest-serving advisors, Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donnellan. According to Politico, this is pretty stark reporting. The two men, Donnellan and Ricchetti, presented President Biden with, quote, new concerns from lawmakers and updates on a fundraising operation that had slowed considerably. Now, get this. They also brought with them new internal polling done by the Biden campaign, which showed that Joe Biden's path to victory was, quote, gone, according to 5 people familiar with the matter. When President Biden first started fielding questions about whether or not he would heed the calls from some in his party that he should not be heading the ticket heading into November, that somebody else would have a better chance at taking on Donald Trump, one of the things that he said was that he would get out if he believed, if he was brought data that showed that he did not have a path to victory, that he did not have a way to win. Again, Politico.com, this is not NBC News reporting, we have not confirmed this, but Politico.com reporting tonight that that data was delivered to him last night at his home in Delaware, where, of course, the president has been isolating with COVID. That is internal Biden polling. We haven't seen that internal polling, so we can't confirm it either publicly or through our own reporting. But we've had Steve Kornacki closely watching the polls around this decision. Steve Kornacki, MSNBC national political correspondent, has been looking at the polling that was staring President Biden in the face heading into this decision, but also the bits and pieces of polling that we've got about how a presidential candidacy of Kamala Harris might look a little different in the polling than what President Biden was up against head-to-head with Trump. Steve, what have you been looking at today?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things, Rachel. Let's call it up and look at it this way. First of all, we've just been tracking. This is an average of all of the polls nationally that have been conducted since that debate at the end of June that set all of this in motion. So nationally, the average had Biden running 2 points behind Trump. Now, a couple things to say about that. First of all, of course, we know that back in 2020, when Biden defeated Trump, never in 2020 did Trump ever lead Biden in the polling average. Biden led it from start to finish that year. This time around, here's Trump leading Biden in a polling average. And frankly, we've seen this for a long time now. It was the end of last summer, the end of the summer of 2023, in our poll, our NBC poll, that for the first time, Donald Trump drew level with Joe Biden. Then he pulled ahead of him, and he's been there in our poll and many other polls since then. So in some ways, looking at these numbers since the debate, just as a lot of Democrats, I think, kind of looked up in that debate and said, whoa, Biden, not quite what we expected in terms of his public performance. You certainly heard Democrats making comments like that. I think one of the things that happened was that the numbers didn't change dramatically from that debate. The polling numbers did not change dramatically, at least nationally. But I think a lot of Democrats also looked at them almost for the first time in a year and started to take them a lot more seriously, because we've been seeing numbers like this for a year or so now in the polls. Now, they did get a little bit worse for Biden nationally, and we do have swing state polling. We've seen a number of swing state polls where Biden's down mid-single digits, some where he's down high single digits. So, there's that as well, certainly, that complicates the path to 270. When you see that the article there saying the path is gone, I would just caution it will forever be unprovable. And that's always going to be a subjective statement there. The path was gone. Just as a reference point, I think always remember in the middle of October 2016, the entire political world, including Donald Trump's own party, concluded that his path to the presidency was, quote, gone, and Donald Trump won in 2016. And I think there might be some lessons from that had Biden stayed in might have been worth considering. But that'll always be academic. We'll never know. It'll be unprovable. But anyway, that is what the national polling's been showing. So then the question for Democrats becomes, OK, if Kamala Harris does become the Democratic candidate, does that change things? So the same polls that produce this average since the debate in the Biden-Trump race, what do they show when Harris is substituted in? A difference, but it's a difference of a point. The Biden at 45, Harris in these same polls, an average 46%, Trump 47% in both of them. So you look at this, and Kamala Harris is not entering, at least in the head-to-head standpoint, with an obvious strength over Joe Biden, nor with an obvious weakness compared to Joe Biden. Really, those numbers are pretty close to the same in terms of a starting point for Harris. Also, just the basic impression of these folks. So Joe Biden, this is the average when you ask that question. Do you have a favorable, unfavorable view? Biden, 36, 57, been seeing numbers like this for a long time with him. Obviously, these are very perilous numbers. What are they for Kamala Harris? Average from the same set of polls. A little bit better. 36 goes up to 38. 57 comes down to 52. But, take a step back. Those are not strong numbers. She doesn't enter the race with strong numbers on that basic question. What's the comparison to Donald Trump here? Trump averaging 41 favorable, 55 unfavorable. Also not strong numbers. A tick, though, above where both Biden and Harris are. Again, this is the starting point for Kamala Harris. The big question here is going to be what happens in the next week, the next 2 weeks, as this sort of rollout of Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate begins. Does she get a second look from some voters? Do these numbers improve? Is there movement in the horse race? Is there a backlash? I think you have to ask as well. Look, Kamala Harris will be the first, if she is nominated, the first candidate from either party since 1968 to be the nominee without contesting in name the presidential primaries. Is there any kind of a backlash to that, to how all of this went down? That's another question. If it's Harris or whoever it is as the Democratic nominee, this is the battleground, of course, they'd be walking into. If it's Harris versus Trump, we've talked about this a lot, the core 6 battleground states, every single one of these states was won by Joe Biden in 2020. 5 of them, Biden had flipped from Donald Trump in 2016. So obviously Harris, if she is the Democratic nominee, doesn't have to win all of these states, but these are the states where I referenced that polling that was showing Biden down in many cases, mid-single digits, sometimes even worse. She's going to have to win a number of these states. Maybe those 3 Midwest states that could potentially hold it for Democrats. There's different combinations here. The other challenge, though, for Harris, or again, whoever the Democratic nominee is, the polling that had come out in the last couple of weeks was also suggesting, and there wasn't enough of it to be definitive at all, but it was suggesting that Democrats were starting to get into trouble outside of the core battleground states. And in particular, there's been polling from Virginia that showed a close race, a tied race in some cases, or even Donald Trump ahead by a couple points. Virginia thought to be a solidly blue state. New Hampshire, Joe Biden won New Hampshire by 7 points back in 2020. It was thought to be safely Democratic. Polling there had a very competitive race. There were rumblings about maybe the statewide vote in Maine, maybe about Minnesota, maybe even about New Mexico. So again, there wasn't a ton of polling there. There were some indications, but that's the other order of business for whoever emerges as the Democratic candidate. Can they make sure there's no trouble in those states and then solidify enough of these swing states to win the election?
Can I just ask you a technical question and just sort of setting expectations? It does seem like what's happening in Democratic politics is the consolidation around Vice President Harris is fast, overwhelming, and therefore I think likely to be pretty much complete in fairly short order. If there isn't going to be a protracted fight in the Democratic Party, and it is very clearly going to be Vice President Harris as the nominee, how soon would you expect high-quality swing state polls to start emerging that reflect that news?
So specifically when you say swing states, I think that complicates it a little bit. In terms of national polls, I would expect in the next 2 weeks or so, we'll start to get a pretty good readout nationally. I mean, because you can just imagine what's going to be happening now. The profiles of Kamala Harris, presumably, interviews, whatever the public rollout looks like here immediately. I think a real test nationally of sort of, is she getting a new look? There'll be plenty of national polls I would expect in the next couple of weeks for that. The hesitation on the swing states, and when I mentioned these swing state polls that showed Biden getting into some trouble here, we haven't had a lot of them. And the swing state polls that we've had A lot of them don't necessarily fall into that, you know, they're proven commodities. They have long track records, widely thought to be very accurate polls. We've had some here. We've had some, and they've certainly shown some trouble for Joe Biden, some real trouble in these states. But I think one of the realities we've had this campaign cycle, and it's complicated why it's all kind of come about this way, is not a ton of high-quality swing state polling. So in terms of when we'll really start to get a readout on that about Harris or whoever the new Democratic candidate is against Trump, I'm not sure. That might take a little bit longer. But I do think, look, if there is going to be some significant movement here one way or the other that shakes up this race, I do think you'll at least get a pretty clear indication of that in the national polling.
All right. Steve Kornacki, thank you, my friend. Really appreciate having you here with us.